All right, let's go ahead and get started. Other people, when they join, but we're already 5 minutes late, and I want to respect everyone's time. So let me share my screen. We're on week 2, and the question we're going to look at this week is, why does anything at all exist? And this is called, this argument is, it has a lot of names actually, but I just called it Leibniz's cosmological argument. It's also, some people call it the argument from contingency, and it goes back a long ways. I mean, Plato and Aristotle basically formulated a form of this argument 2,500 years ago. And Thomas Aquinas wrote about it in about 1250 AD. So this different forms of this argument have been around a long, long time. So G.W. Leibniz, a lot of people don't know this, but he was co-discoverer of calculus. So when Isaac Newton was discovering calculus and writing down the implications of it, Leibniz was discovering it at the same time. So he's given credit as the co-discoverer of calculus. And he said in the 18th century, he wrote, the first question which should rightly be asked is, why is there something rather than nothing? So this was sort of for him a fundamental question that any thinking human being should ask. So as I said last week, this argument can be very difficult. So in my opinion, it's the most difficult argument in the book. The good news is, from here on out, I think the arguments do get more and more straightforward, but this one's very abstract. And so what I've done in order to help you understand, I'm going to present several different versions of the argument. And the goal is that hopefully one or more of them will click with you. And when I went through, I think there's 5 arguments in the slides, and I had more than that. I had 7 or 8, and my 20-year-old daughter sat down with me a couple weeks ago, and I went through the presentation with her, and she helped. She said, get rid of that one, get rid of that one. That one's confusing. No one's going to understand that. This argument is just like that one. So get rid of one of them. So she was very helpful in helping me slice them down. But I've ended up with, I think, 5. So what I want to do first is watch a 5-minute video. So just like last week, the Reasonable Faith website, or I think it's called Dr. Craig Videos on YouTube, they have a really good animated version of the argument. And so we're going to watch that first. It's only 5 minutes long. And so once that's done, then we'll jump back into the slides.
Amazing universe. Have you ever wondered why it exists? Why does anything at all exist? Gottfried Leibniz wrote, the first question which should rightly be asked is, why is there something rather than nothing? He came to the conclusion that the explanation is found in God. But is this reasonable? Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. The universe exists. From these, it follows logically that the explanation of the universe's existence is God. The logic of this argument is airtight. If the 3 premises are true, the conclusion is unavoidable. But are they more plausibly true than false? The 3rd premise is undeniable for anyone seeking truth. But what about the 1st premise? Why not say, the universe is just there, and that's all? No explanation needed. End of discussion. Well, imagine you and a friend are hiking in the woods and come across a shiny sphere lying on the ground. You would, naturally, wonder how it came to be there. And you'd think it odd if your friend said, there's no reason or explanation for it. Stop wondering. It just is. And if the ball were larger, it would still require an explanation. In fact, if the ball were the size of the universe, the change in its size wouldn't remove the need for an explanation. Indeed, curiosity about the existence of the universe seems scientific and intuitive. Someone might say, if everything that exists needs an explanation, what about God? Doesn't he need an explanation? And if God doesn't need an explanation, then why does the universe need an explanation? To address this, Leibniz makes a key distinction between things that exist necessarily and things that exist contingently. Things that exist necessarily exist by necessity of their own nature. It's impossible for them not to exist. Many mathematicians think that abstract objects like numbers and sets exist like this. They're not caused to exist by something else, they just exist by necessity of their own nature. Things that exist contingently are caused to exist by something else. Most of the things we're familiar with exist contingently. They don't have to exist. They only exist because something else caused them to exist. If your parents had never met, you wouldn't exist. There's no reason to think the world around us had to exist. If the universe had developed differently, there might have been no stars or planets. It's logically possible that the whole universe might not have existed. It doesn't exist necessarily, it exists contingently. If the universe might not have existed, why does it exist? The only adequate explanation for the existence of a contingent universe is that its existence rests on a non-contingent being, something that cannot not exist because of the necessity of its own nature. It would exist no matter what. So, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. But what about our second premise? Is it reasonable to call the explanation of the universe God? Well, what is the universe? It's all of space-time reality, including all matter and energy. It follows that if the universe has a cause of its existence, that cause cannot be part of the universe. It must be non-physical and immaterial, beyond space and time. The list of entities that could possibly fit this description is fairly short, and abstract objects cannot cause anything. Leibniz's contingency argument shows that the explanation for the existence of the universe can be found only in the existence of God. Or, if you prefer not to use the term God, you may simply call him the extremely powerful, uncaused, necessarily existing, non-contingent, non-physical, immaterial, eternal being who created the entire universe and everything in it.
Okay, I love the cheeky ending where he says, well, if you don't want to call it God, fine, here's what it is. And of course, every adjective he used describes God. So before we proceed with the arguments, we need to go back over the definitions of necessity and contingency, because these two, you have to understand what these two words mean or the argument doesn't make sense. So things that exist necessarily exist by a necessity of their own nature. So it belongs to their very nature to exist. They must exist. They cannot possibly not exist. So that's what a necessary being is. Oops. Let me turn that off. Okay. Things that exist contingently can fail to exist, and so they need an external cause to explain why they do in fact exist. They might exist or they might not exist. So many mathematicians think that numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities exist necessarily. And some philosophers think that the laws of logic exist necessarily. They're not caused to exist by something else. They just exist by necessity of their own nature. Now, things that exist contingently are the things that we see with our five senses, or the things we sense with our five senses. So these are things that are caused to exist by something else. And so they're not necessary beings. They exist because something else has produced them. And so contingent beings would be familiar objects like people, planets, galaxies. So in the slides I sent you, I mean, every one of these, all of these people are contingent beings. All of us are contingent beings. The planets are contingent. The galaxies are contingent. All of these things could possibly not exist. And in fact, we know all of these things did not exist at some point in the past. So here's the approach to studying the argument. What we're going to do first is we're going to look at 5 different versions of the argument to make sure you actually understand the arguments. And then we're going to look at 6 objections to the argument. All right, so here's my version of the argument. And the reason I say it's not really my version, it's just, to me, after studying this for 15 years, this is the version of the argument that to me is easiest to grasp. But for you, you might not like it. That's why I've got 4 more after this. And let me just, I need to, if I could ask everyone to mute your microphones. It sounds like there's one person that's not muted, and I can hear them. I can hear you every once in a while. So thank you. Okay, so premise 1 is something cannot come from nothing. And I think this is pretty obvious that if you literally have nothing, then you can't get anything from it, right? Because there's nothing. And when we say nothing, we mean that metaphysically, meaning nothing exists. There is absolutely nothing. And for some reason, a lot of people get confused by this, especially physicists. They'll say things like, oh, well, there might be a quantum vacuum. And I'm like, well, no, that's not nothing. A quantum vacuum is something. Or they'll say, well, you could have the laws of nature. I'm like, again, that is something. When I say nothing, I mean nothing. And so if you ever have nothing, something cannot come from it. But if anything exists right now, then something has always existed. In other words, since something cannot come from nothing, if something exists right now, that means that there's something that's always existed. And we know things exist right now, right? It is undeniable that I exist. I cannot deny that I exist. And so the fact that I exist, I know that something has always existed. And if something has always existed, then it exists necessarily. That's the definition of a necessary being. Therefore, a necessary being exists. So I think that's a simple form of the argument, or I think it's simple. And I like that form of the argument. And again, it's very similar to what Charlotte said. But I'm going to do 4 more versions of the argument now, including the one from the book. I'm not going to skip the one from the book. All right, here's the argument from the book, which we just saw the video, so it should be familiar to you. So premise 1 says, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. If the universe, which is all matter, space, and time, has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Now, when you first see this premise, you might think, well, how can you say that? How can you say that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God? Well, the key is we're defining the universe as all matter, space, and time. And God is immaterial, spaceless, and timeless. So by definition, if the universe is all of the physical world, right, it's all matter, space, time, and energy, then if you need an explanation of all of that, then it has to be something that is not made of matter, space, and time. Does that make sense? And that's who God is, right? Christians believe God is immaterial, spaceless, timeless. And so that's why he can say in this premise that if the universe has an explanation, that explanation is God. And then premise 3 is the universe exists, which again is, the person that denies this is not really having a serious conversation with you, or they have serious mental illness. And then the conclusion is, therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. So, I think that's also a good form of the argument. And it says very similar thing to the first argument I showed you. However, I have 3 more versions in case you don't like these 2. And by the way, if anybody has a question, then just jump in and ask while we're going. Just unmute and ask your question. Okay, so this is version 3 of the argument. Every part of the universe is dependent. In this version of the argument, I've substituted the word dependent instead of contingent, but contingent and dependent are pretty much synonyms. They basically mean the same thing, but more people are familiar with the word dependent than contingent. So you might like the argument better because, I know what dependent means. So premise 1, every part of the universe is dependent. Premise 2, if every part is dependent, then the whole universe must also be dependent, right? So if you have a collection of things and they're all dependent on their existence, then the whole collection must be dependent, right? That just makes logical sense. If I have 5 objects that are each individually made of wood, then all 5 objects put together are all made of wood. So likewise, if every part of the universe, if every planet, every person, every star, every galaxy is dependent, then the whole universe must be dependent. Therefore, the whole universe is dependent right now on some independent being beyond it for its present existence. So that was the end of that argument. That one's real simple. The whole universe is dependent right now on some independent being beyond it for its present existence. So again, this is another argument from contingency. If every part of the universe is dependent on something else for its existence, then the universe as a whole must be dependent on something. And that independent being is what explains its existence. So here's your mental health break, which I promised you every week. This is my dog, Leo, again. And he says, I might be cute, but I am not a necessary being. Unfortunately for me, Leo someday will cease to exist. And, 4 years ago, he did not exist. So he is a contingent being, which is really sad, because you hate to lose your dog someday. But I'm sure many of you have gone through that with pets that you love. I wish he were a necessary being, but he's not. All right, enough of Leo. Okay, so here's argument 4, or version 4. Now, this version of the argument, if you read the slides, is very long. There's like 11 or 12 steps to it. And the reason I included it is because it tries to go very slowly, step by step by step through the argument in a slower way. And it was interesting when I taught this in person, I asked, there was like 7 or 8 of us, and I said, so what did you guys think of version 4? And one person spoke up and said, I didn't like it. It was confusing and it took too long to get to the point, and I preferred the earlier arguments. And as soon as he stopped talking, someone else said, I completely disagree. I thought argument 4 was the easiest to understand. So I don't know. We'll see what you guys think. All right, so here's version 4. And this is actually from a Christian philosopher named Peter Kraft. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him, but he's a really, really smart guy. So he says, premise 1, we notice around us things that come into being and go out of being. A tree, for example, grows from a tiny shoot, flowers brilliantly, then withers and dies. Whatever comes into being or goes out of being does not have to be. Its non-being is a real possibility. So suppose that nothing has to be. That is, that non-being is a real possibility for everything. You know, another way to say this is suppose that everything that exists is contingent or dependent. Then right now, nothing would exist. For ... If the universe began to exist, then all being must trace its origin to some past moment before which there existed literally nothing at all. But from nothing, nothing comes. So, I mean, this harkens back to the very first premise of the first argument where I said, you know, something cannot come from nothing. So from nothing, nothing comes. So the universe could not have begun. So if everything was contingent and dependent on and had the real possibility to not exist, then the universe could never have begun because there would be nothing to begin it. But suppose that the universe never began. Then for the infinitely long duration of cosmic history, all being had the built-in possibility not to be. But if in an infinite time that possibility was never realized, then it could not have been a real possibility at all. So there must exist something which has to exist, which cannot not exist. This sort of being is called necessary. Now, either this necessity belongs to the thing in itself or it is derived from another being. If it's derived from another being, there must ultimately exist a being whose necessity is not derived. And that is an absolutely necessary being. Again, this is a really long, drawn-out version of the very first argument I gave. So some of you will like this and some of you will not. This absolutely necessary being is God. So this argument 4, kind of goes a lot slower, step by step, trying to prove that if at any time nothing existed, then today nothing would exist. But things do exist today. Therefore, we must have had an absolutely necessary being, and that necessary being is God. I mean, that's Muslims, Jews, and Christians define God as a necessary being. Like if you go look in any theology book written by Muslims, Jews, or Christians, they will say that God is a necessary being. You know, when I was in seminary, I had to take 4 systematic theology classes. And one of those classes was, half of the class was on the attributes of God, of which there were like 20 or 30 attributes of God. And God being a necessary being, I think that was covered in the first or second attribute. It's pretty fundamental to God to be a necessary being. Okay, we're on to argument 5. So premise 1, there are beings that begin to exist and cease to exist, i.e. possible beings. But not all beings can be possible beings, because what comes to exist does so only through what already exists. Nothing cannot cause something. I mean, how many times have we heard that in the last 30 minutes? Therefore, there must be a being whose existence is necessary, i.e. one that never came into being and will never cease to be. There cannot be an infinite regress of necessary beings, each of which has its necessity dependent on another, because an infinite regress of dependent causes is impossible. Now, I want to give you an analogy or an illustration of why an infinite regress of dependent causes is impossible, because you will hear this response given by atheists sometimes. They'll say, well, we don't need a necessary being. We just have an infinite number of causes, stretching out to infinity. And that's how everything exists. But that doesn't work. So I have here a picture of a chandelier. And right now the chandelier appears to be hanging in midair. So to explain how the chandelier is hanging here, you could say, well, there's a hook connected to the chandelier that's holding it up. And that's what's causing it to hold up. But then I would say, well, but what's causing that hook to hold it up? Well, there's another hook in the chain, right? I'm forming a chain. Okay, well, now you've given me 2 hooks that are holding up a chandelier, but how are they hanging? Well, I just add a 3rd hook. Well, how's that hook hanging? Well, there's a 4th hook. So you can see where this is going, right? I can't just keep adding hooks, right? These hooks think of those as dependent causes. So each hook depends on the one above it to keep it hanging. So the chandelier counts on the 1st hook, the 1st hook on the 2nd, the 2nd on the 3rd, et cetera, et cetera. So I can just keep adding hooks, but ultimately I've not explained anything. In fact, I've made the problem worse, because now I don't have to just explain how a chandelier is hanging in thin air. I have to explain how a chandelier in an infinite number of chain links are hanging in thin air. So you could see, by adding an infinite regress of dependent causes, not only have you not solved the problem, you've made it infinitely worse. So it always cracks me up when people think that, oh, you just have an infinite, regress of causes, that solves the problem. In reality, it makes the problem infinitely worse. So what we need, and again, this is an illustration, is we need a ceiling, right, that the hook connects to. And the ceiling in my illustration is an independent cause. It is a necessary being that all of the other chain links and chandelier are hanging from. And a smart aleck in the class Sunday morning said, well, actually the ceiling's dependent too on the frame of the house and the ground underneath. And I'm like, yeah, I know. But you have to stop the analogy somewhere, right? The point is, having an infinite number of chain links doesn't solve the problem. You have to have a ceiling to hang the chandelier. And so the ceiling is a necessary, if you can see my scribble, is a necessary being. And these are dependent or contingent in this illustration. So that's why having an infinite regress of causes doesn't work. And think about how powerful this is, because I'm not talking about going back in time. I'm talking about right now, right? So think of that chandelier is hanging in the air right now. To explain its existence right this minute, you need a necessary being for that chandelier to hang right now. Likewise, to explain my existence right now, there must be a necessary being somewhere out there that's holding up all of the causes that are causing me to exist right now, right? Gravity, all the laws of physics, the chemistry going on in my body, all the things that allow me to exist, those are just like these chain links. So there has to be some being that is independent and necessary, that is keeping all of those things existing right now. So God didn't just create the universe and go on vacation. He has to continue to sustain the universe right now, every instant. Like if he stops paying attention, then we all cease to exist immediately. All right, so to continue the version 5, so an infinite regress of dependent causes is impossible. A necessary being cannot be a dependent being, as we just saw from the illustration. Therefore, there must be a first being that is necessary in itself and not dependent on another for its existence. Or to put it in the analogy of the chandelier, there must be a ceiling that is not itself dependent on anything else. Okay, so those were the 5 arguments. And what I'm going to do now is go through 6 objections. Before I do that, does anybody have a question about the 5 arguments or anything I went over? Okay, so here's some common objections to this argument, and most of these were in the book, maybe all of them. So objection 1, well, God has to have a cause to explain him, right? If the universe needs a cause, then God needs a cause. So this is very similar to the 8-year-old that says, "Mommy, who made God?" Or, who caused God? Except adults actually ask this question sometimes. And the answer is the explanation of God's existence is his own nature. Or put another way, Christians have always defined God as self-existent, as a necessary being, as someone who's always existed. Like that's how we define God. So nothing caused God to exist. He exists because of his own nature, right? You have to have a ceiling. You have to have a necessary being. And Christians have always understood God to be that being. So to say that God has to have a cause to explain him is to completely misunderstand how Christians and Muslims and Jews define God. All right, objection 2. This objection says the universe doesn't need any explanation of its existence. It, like the Bertrand Russell quote, it just is. So how do we respond to that? Well, there's a few things we could say. First of all, if everything we see in the universe needs an explanation for its existence, then how is it that the sum total of all those things, which is the universe, does not need an explanation? That makes no sense, right? I use the example of if I have 5 objects and they're all made of wood, then the collection of objects is made of wood. So if everything in the universe needs an explanation for its existence, then how could the universe be exempt? But to continue, notice how unscientific this response is. For modern cosmology, which is the study of the universe, is devoted to the search for an explanation of the universe's existence. I mean, there's whole branches of physicists, like this is what they do. This is what they study. Guys with PhDs who know way too much math. So this attitude of the atheist would literally cripple science, because the atheist would say, the universe doesn't need an explanation. Who cares? You guys are wasting your time trying to figure it out. All right, objection 3. It is impossible for the universe to have an explanation. So this is not the universe has no explanation. This objection says, well, it's impossible for the universe to have an explanation. And so the response to this is, you're assuming the universe is all there is when you say that it's impossible for the universe to have an explanation, and you're assuming that God doesn't exist. But that's the very thing we're trying to investigate. So you've just jumped ahead to the conclusion without making an argument. I mean, it's like the atheist standing there and going, well, God doesn't exist, therefore the universe has no explanation. Well, you have to argue for that, right? That's what we're doing here. We're having an argument. I'm presenting premises and I'm presenting reasons to believe those premises. So if you want to just say that God doesn't exist and the universe is all there is, you have to provide an argument. You have to explain why it's impossible for the universe to have an explanation. Objection 4. If we grant that the universe needs an explanation, then why think that this explanation is God? And I covered this earlier in the presentation, but it bears repeating. So think of what the universe is. It's all of space-time reality, including all matter and energy. So it follows that if the universe has a cause of its existence, that cause must be a non-physical, immaterial being who is beyond space and time. And if you recall the end of the video is like, fine, if you don't want to call that God, then call it a non-physical, immaterial, non-spatial, eternal, necessary, uncontingent, non-contingent being. Okay, so which just happens to be the definition that monotheistic theologians gave God 2,000 years ago. Objection 5. Well, maybe an abstract object is the cause of the universe, not God. So maybe there's some other timeless, spaceless, immaterial thing out there which caused the universe. Why does it have to be God? Well, it's because abstract objects can't cause anything. That's part of what it means to be abstract, right? Abstract means not concrete. So an abstract object can't do anything. The number 7 can't cause any effects, right? The number 7 is an idea. It can't do anything. It has no power to act. So the cause of the existence of the universe must be a transcendent mind. And Bob, this partially answers your question about why does it have to be a personal cause, but not completely. So we will get into that more next week. But what we're saying is there has to be some kind of a transcendent mind, because we know from experience that minds, which are immaterial, can act on the physical world, right? We do that every day, right? My mind is telling my mouth and my vocal cords to move right now. My mind is telling me to hold this little Apple pencil in my hand and draw squiggly lines under the slides. So we have experience of minds being able to act on the physical world. Objection 6. this objection says, well, the universe just exists necessarily. Like you say God exists necessarily, I say the universe exists necessarily. So the universe is the ceiling that holds up all the chain links to the chandelier, right? That's what this objection says. And, if I was an atheist trapped in the corner by this argument, this is probably the one I would trot out. I would go, well, you say God exists necessarily. I say the universe exists necessarily. And I would say, ha, we've got a stalemate. Respond to that. So here's my response. I actually have several responses. So as we look about the universe, none of the things that make it up, whether stars, planets, galaxies, dust, radiation, or what have you, none of it seems to exist necessarily. They could all fail to exist. Indeed, at some point in the past, when the universe was very dense, none of them did exist. So physicists tell us that, and this goes back to the Big Bang model, physicists tell us that none of these things existed in the early moments of the universe. None of them existed. So nothing that we see in the universe seems to exist necessarily. In addition, physicists believe that all matter is composed of fundamental particles, for example, quarks, bosons, and leptons. But there is no reason to think that these particles exist necessarily. I mean, there's nothing about these fundamental particles that makes them exist necessarily. They might not exist. In fact, it's entirely possible that they didn't exist at some point in time. So there's nothing about them that makes them necessary. So if a person says that the universe, which is all of space, time, and matter, exists necessarily, in my opinion, they're making a statement that has no evidence from sensory experience or science. It is pure wishful thinking, which is what atheists commonly accuse theists of, right? Christians are supposed to be the ones that are, have made up God, and it's just wishful thinking and it's magic and so forth. But it turns out if the atheist says the universe exists necessarily, he has just given the universe magical properties. He's like sprinkled fairy dust on the universe and said, even though I have no evidence from sensory experience or science, I proclaim the universe to exist necessarily, right? And to me, it's a terrible argument. It is total wishful thinking. And, if I was having a discussion with the atheist, I would ask, why is it you have faith that the universe exists necessarily, but you won't consider God to be a necessary being behind the universe? There's something else going on there. It's not an intellectual argument. All right. So conclusion is God is the explanation of the existence of the universe. And moreover, the argument implies that God is an uncaused, unembodied mind who transcends the physical universe and who exists necessarily. Yeah, and I think that's it for the presentation. So, and then, the last slide is make sure you read chapter 4 for next week, which will be on the second cosmological argument, which in my mind is easier to understand, but we'll see what you think next week. All right, so we have, several minutes that we can do some Q&A and see if you guys have any questions. It's only 8 after 7, so if anybody has any questions or comments or, I don't know, whatever you want to say, fire away.